In chapter 4, Peter deals with the most important question relating to suffering. Perhaps one that has been in your mind all this while. Why does suffering happen? Let's look at the judgment of the world. In verses 1 to 3, Peter said, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God." Believers are called to have the same attitude of Christ. That is, to live for the will of God. A person with this attitude will suffer as Christ did. Peter said that whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. The will of God and sin are at opposite ends of the scale. You either live for the will of God or you live for sin. You cannot do both. When you decide to live for God, you are parting ways with sin. You are done with sin. Our separating with sin upsets those for whom sin is a way of life. In verse 3 to 4, Peter said, "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless wild living, and they heap abuse on you." Before we came to Jesus, we were part of the moral system of the world. Sin was our way of life. When we became Christians, we turned our back on this kind of lifestyle. Sinners will be offended. They will regard us as turncoats. Christians suffer because we have been judged by the world for rejecting their lifestyle of sin. Unfortunately for the world, they do not realize that they have to face a greater judgment. Peter said, "But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. The ultimate judge is God. The basis on which God will judge is the gospel. That is why the gospel is preached to those now dead. This refers to sinners who are spiritually dead. If they turn to Christ, they are made alive in the spirit and escape the judgment of God. However, they will be judged according to human standards in regard to the body. Peter was referring to the judgment that the world makes on those who are done with sin. The believer may suffer in his body, but in his spirit he lives for God and follows the will of God. For such a person, there is no judgment. It is better to face the temporal judgment of the world and suffer in the body than to face the eternal judgment of God. Next, let's consider the judgment to come. Peter goes on as follows: "The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers." The end of all things that Peter referred to is the culmination point of God's plan for mankind. The ancient Hebrews believed that there will be a time where every soul has to give an account to God and to accept the just desert for their actions. Between now and God's judgment, how should Christians live? Peter said, "Be self-controlled and sober-minded." The first word means to be calm and composed. The second word means not drunk. When one is drunk, one loses his self-control and perspective. We must be able to see our present circumstances against the backdrop of God's plan for mankind. With this controlled state of mind, we are able to pray intelligently and according to God's will. The confidence in God's coming judgment should affect two areas of our lives: our relationship with our fellow believers and our relationship with God. First, our relationship with our fellow believers. Peter said, "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms." There are three aspects of love. First, the strength of love. Peter said, "Love each other deeply." The word deeply means stretched or extended. It is easy to say that we love. We will never know the quality of our love for our fellow believers until we see how far it can be stretched without breaking. The best test of that is how we react to the sins of our fellow believers. Peter said, love covers over a multitude of sins. In the suffering church, there could be many wrongs committed by church members against one another. In times of suffering, many are guilty of weakness, selfishness, betrayal, lack of love, surrendering to temptation and pressure, and a host of other wrongs in trying to escape suffering. Love means forgiving and protecting each other's reputation. Instead of exposing and shaming a fellow church member, we should forgive and give him a second chance. This will require us to grant him the space to redeem himself and retain his good name so that he may go on to be a useful servant of Christ. Next, the sacrifice of love. Peter called on believers to offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Christians fleeing persecution have no choice but to seek refuge with their fellow Christians. This would understandably put a strain on the life and resources of host families. As a result, Christian homes would be shut, or if open, there would be grumblings. Both host and guest would find themselves in a tensed and awkward situation. Brotherly affection would turn into resentment. Love requires sacrifice. There's no easy way of showing love without the accompanying inconvenience or hardship. Sometimes a price has to be paid in order to meet the needs of our fellow believers who are suffering. Lastly, the service of love. In times of hardship, there is the temptation to withdraw from service. Peter reminded believers that God has entrusted each one of them with a gift. They were stewards or custodians of these gifts which were meant for the church. Believers exercise their gift by serving others. Next, Peter explored the Christian's relationship with God while waiting for God's judgment. We should do three things. For the first, Peter said, "But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed." There can be no rejoicing in suffering. However, suffering that is a participation in the sufferings of Christ is the greatest privilege imaginable. Sharing with Christ is not just in happy things, but also in painful things. Now, in spite of suffering, we rejoice. When Christ returns, we will be overjoyed. Secondly, Peter said, "However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name." Have you ever thought what a privilege it is to be called a Christian? Who can lay claim to the right to bear the name of the Son of God? The name Christian cannot be bought or earned, yet that name attracts opposition. and promises hardship. As Christ suffered, so we who are called by his name also suffer. Yes, it's painful, but what a privilege. For that we must praise God that unworthy creatures like us can bear that wonderful name. Thirdly, Peter said, "So then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good." Peter's final word on the subject of suffering is this: trust God. Suffering believers should commit themselves to their faithful Creator. The word commit describes the act of depositing something with a bank. Earthly banks can fail, but we still trust them. We put our money with them. Then we go on with our lives without worrying about our money. God is greater than any bank. He never failed. Our souls and futures deposited with him is protected by his almighty power. Thus, we need not worry about our destiny, and we can get on with a life of doing good. I hope you have been encouraged. If you are undergoing suffering, remember these three things: rejoice, praise, and trust. Join me in our next video as we conclude our study of 1 Peter. To make sure you don't miss our final installment, please click on the subscribe button below the screen and you will receive a notification of our next video when it is ready.